Well, let's get started. So throughout the 5 Sundays prior to Holy Week, we are going to spend time kind of plumbing the depths of these themes that we're addressing in worship. Today is being Blessed are the Imperfect, and here are a lovely group of people who have consented to tell their own stories of imperfection. So kudos to all of you. Thank you so much for being willing to do this. And I do have to say, when I asked folks about this, they were actually fairly quick to respond with, yeah, I can do that, especially if there's 4 of us up there, right? You're not gonna, we're not gonna suspend animation and just focus on Frank for the whole time. The idea of this conversation is for us to actually have faith conversation together, and I think particularly important in this, in these 5 weeks, is the opportunity for us to hear each other's stories. Carolyn was just saying something about the fact that she has church friends that she has known for decades, but knows them mostly from eating a donut and having coffee and saying, how are you doing? And that we sometimes miss the great opportunity to hear each other's stories. So that's one gift of our time together. The other is that as I began to talk with Edwin about how we were going to frame these conversations, it occurs to me that in order to frame the conversation, it's important for us to hear about each other's callings. And so the continuation of our conversation about vocation, and each of these folks has been asked to talk about just one story that is a reflection of their own experience of being imperfect and the things that they have learned from that experience. But it is one facet of calling, right? So Frank Payne has been working in the building industry forever. He is partially responsible for the roof over our heads, and so I've asked him to tell a story in that vein. Kate Bassett is a graphic artist. Is that the proper term? Designer. And so she actually produces a product that has to be visually appealing to people. Brendan Cesarato is a musician. You've seen him up front playing drums for us many weeks during our jazz season. He also is, and talk about the perfect setting for imperfection, a middle school band. So we bow to your authority. And Randy Belstad is a woodworker, and I'm just going to tell you a brief story of my own that actually made me think about asking a woodworker to be up here. And that is that when my first daughter was born, my husband was in the process of making the most beautiful maple crib. And he'd actually modified the design in a way that I thought was very visually appealing. And yet, when Elizabeth was born, he was not ready for it to be used. And, babies don't need a full-blown crib, so we had the bassinet that had been passed on from the earlier generations and used that, but then we got to the point where she was ready to move on from the bassinet, and I said, we have to have the crib done now. And so he brought it in, and he set it up, and with all of the mechanisms and all of the complexity of that design, I looked at it and I was just astounded at how beautiful the clear stain on the maple and how beautifully it was done. And he looked at it, and all he could think was that the railing in front had about 1/8 of an inch, it was about 1/8 of an inch off on one of the railings, and he knew that he'd put wood putty up in that one spot, and he could not look at that crib and not see the imperfection in it. And the thing that was so sad to me is that he did not get to just bask in its beauty. Now that crib was passed on to my younger daughter and then to their cousin who was born later. And so it has been well loved and well used, and I know that when my 27-year-old, who has actually mentioned the possibility of children, has children, that it will be used by the next generation. But it's astounding to me that we can create beautiful things and yet focus so laser focused on the imperfections of the things that we create. And what that says about how we are as human beings, particularly in a world where being productive, and not just productive, but being able, Liz Gilbert had this really great interview with Kate Bowler, where they talked about it's not just about being productive, but about getting seen now as being productive, and not only that, but being able to monetize being productive and popular. That, you know, this is the era that we're in, is that we have this illusion of perfection, when in fact we know that there are those flaws that we see in the things that we do. And so the challenge for us as people of faith then is to come to terms really faithfully about what that means in our relationship with God, and what we think we need to be, but also what happens when we are not what we think we need to be, or what the world tells us we should be. So we're going to just start with your stories. And Randy, why don't we start with you, and you can share your memory.
Oh, well, that's a good lead. Talking about wood products, but I only really expect perfection out of two people, anywhere near perfection. That's the person doing surgery on me and the person flying my plane. Otherwise, we're all human. Perfection is not in. The only perfect person we have ever had got hung on a cross, so we don't really want to,
well for him.
aspire to that. So woodworking. I am a hobbyist, an ish kind of guy. I don't read blueprints. Frank is a woodworker. Frank and I tinker. As my grandpa said, I putter around the shop. I make things that you don't really need. They're little craft things. They're little things. I don't build. I know what I can do and I know what I can't do. And so I start out with imperfect wood. I use mostly old, salvaged stuff. It's not, sometimes, to begin with, it's not pretty to look at, but we can take off some of the rough spots, clean it up a little bit, and I think, for me, that's kind of like us. We all know that there's some rough spots, some things we'd like to get rid of, but we do the best we can to cover them up and make them presentable, but they're still there. And I think that's one of the reasons why what I do, especially, like I said, I make these little nativity scenes, and they're with a piece of wood about that long and 4 inches wide. And it's old and it's dirty and I can clean it up and cut it out, and I sand it and take off a few of the rough spots, and it is what it is. It represents us, and seeking perfection, you're chasing your tail, and it's just going to cause you a lot of angst. So that saying, practice makes you perfect. No. Practice improves performance. So you just, another saying I just had in from a class I'm taking is, don't let perfection stop you from productivity. Because if you start a project, no matter what it is, you can get paralyzed by everything that can go wrong to do this, that will prevent you from even starting it. At some point, you just have to let it go and say, good enough is good enough. And 99% of the time, the finished product, people don't see the imperfect. The person who will focus in on that one thing, it's just like Barb will say, how'd the choir sound? Great, wonderful. You don't pick out if some one person missed one little note. So for the vast majority of us, we're our own worst enemy in doing whatever endeavor it is that we're about. So just move forward and do the best you can and take it from there.
Thank you, Randy. I'm thinking that as we go along, people are welcome to ask questions or make comments that will contribute to the conversation. One of the things that I'm thinking about is that perfection might also, no, I think I'll say it more definitively, perfection is the enemy of creativity. Because creativity starts with experimentation and trying out ideas or practices. And so I think we also limit our creativity. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Well, as an owner of one of those nativities, all I ever saw was the beauty in it. Kind of like Lori with the crib. We're our own worst enemy, and sometimes you need to maybe back off and see through others' eyes.
Well, I was thinking just about how you take that imperfect wood, and how in life so often what becomes our greatest success or what becomes the most valuable to us or brings us the most joy is things that start out as imperfect things that then we work with and stuff, and just how amazing that is that we can take something imperfect and bring it into something that becomes so beautiful and amazing.
So do you not feel that every project you take is an improvement over the last one? That in the last one you learned something that you can now apply to get you closer to perfection?
Well, again, that's the practice improves performance, yes. And so you find an easier way, you find a better way or whatever, but the end product is still, and that, again, I choose things that there's no way you're going to get them perfect. And so you lean into that and make that work. And each one is different. There's no way that they can be exactly the same. You're using different, everything is different wood, whatever. So you just take it from there.
That's why we have 8 doll high chairs in our basement.
Each one is a little better than the other. It took me less time to do that. That's the part. Improving, it's about the process. It's the process. You know.
I also would mention that when Randy let us know in staff that he was making these nativity scenes, one of the first things I thought of was 2 young families in our congregation who might not have acquired their first nativity. And I was thinking about these. I had, when the girls were growing up, I had these little quilted nativities, and they always put them in their mouths and sucked on them, you know. But so I asked Randy, I said, are these are these safe for babies to put in their mouths? And he said, absolutely. The process they use to stain and prepare them made them safe for little kids, so there is a benefit in thinking through all of those details that ends up having them serve in a whole different way than you might have imagined.
Well, and you don't want to make them a work of art that everyone is, don't touch that.
Right.
Oh my God, don't, this, so it's all about what the plan is for it.
Right. And we want children to be in the story and handle the nativity.
To physically be able to pick it up and
Right.
ask questions and.
Yeah, and
Yes.
to tell the story and move things
Right,
around.
right.
And have their teeth marks on the cross, the star. And,
They're just mineral oil on it, so you're good to go.
Very good. Brendan, share with us.
So I've been teaching, this is my 18th year teaching middle school. I've taught at other levels, but I've always been teaching in middle school level, and actually that was the thing that I chose to focus in on. My first job was actually my alma mater, and I was teaching K through 12, and I thought, these middle school kids are strange and interesting and fascinating, and so I just decided, like, when I started looking for other jobs and looking to focus a little bit more on my teaching practice, that middle school was it, and I've been there since. I've been teaching middle school since, and I kind of make the joke with my students, it's like, I still haven't figured out middle school yet. And when I do, I can move on and go into high school or something else. But I like the idea of thinking about the process of things. In the education field, we use the phrase progress, not perfection, because the idea is that we're constantly working. Again, we have an ideal in our mind about the thing that we're working toward, but we know that it's always a work in progress. That we, through the practice of working on music every day, one of the things that, especially in band, we work on long tones. Because that's the way that kids shape their sound, and I think of it in a way that a carver, like somebody that works in clay or works in carving, wood carving, it's like we get this rough sound when kids first pick up their instrument. It's very rough and it's very harsh, and I actually had a middle school kid who was very wise beyond her years say, "Mr. C, how do you teach middle school all day?" And she's a saxophone player, and saxophone is the worst. It sounds like a dying goose when kids first play it. And then, and I tell kids, it's like, I need you to play loud, and then we can shape the sound from there. Like, we can get it to a point where it's pleasing to the ear, but at first we have to make some really bad sounds. We shape it, we mold it, and then it becomes something that's really enjoyable to listen to, but it takes time to do that. And and in middle school, it's it's usually 1 step forward and 5 steps backwards. And I had one of the things I was thinking about the other day is that I had this lesson plan, and I was all excited. I'm like, this class is going to go so well. And then I got partway through the lesson, and the kids were just kind of off the wall and had other ideas. It's like, I have my focus, like, I'm all about the music. Like, I've got this musician brain that says, like, let's get to work. And it turned out it was Valentine's Day, and there was lots of candy going around, and kids were just amped up. And I'm like, okay. And I got really upset, because it's like, how can they not understand where I'm going with this? And the answer to that is because they're middle school kids, and they have their agendas, and so, like, earlier in my career, I think a thing like that may have, like, taken me the rest of the day or even a week to get over. But I had a moment where I kind of made a joke about it to my next class, and I said, "Oh, you guys better be better than my last class." And I said, like, what happened, Mr. Seal? I can't tell all the details, just know that it was kind of rough. And they were talking and they were loud, and then I know that you guys can do better than that. Oh, well, what do we need to do, Mr. C? And I said, right now, I just need you to like show me your musician's focus. Okay, we can do that. And it was funny because I went from being mad and frustrated to like, it just flipped a switch, and I was like, okay, we can do this. I can restart, and I can like let myself just have that moment of vulnerability where, again, in my younger days, I probably would not have been so willing to let that go. And I would have been, angry mostly with myself about it and blaming myself for the behavior of kids, which is unpredictable and challenging at times, and I think in middle school, one of the things that I have to always come to grips with is that, sometimes the law of entropy applies, like things go from a state of being orderly to disorderly, and that seems to be the way they want to go, and my job is to like somehow create cohesion amongst kids and to help them see like the benefits of working together and working toward a common goal. And, the benefit of that is when it actually comes together and they figure it out, and those wonderful moments where they like, it's like a light bulb clicks on and they're like, did you hear what we just did? Yes, I did. That's it. That's the moment. But, it can be a challenge, and, when you sent out the email, I had that day that I with you. I had just gone back from it, and I remember telling Heidi, it's like, I don't know if I can go back tomorrow. I was like ready to get in the car and drive somewhere and not come back. And so it's one of those things where for me, the difficulty is the being hard on myself and accepting responsibility for everything that happens in my classroom. And like when I'm gentle with myself about that, it's okay. What it is when I'm being difficult and being hard on myself about it, that's where the challenges come in, where I'm accepting blame for things that I really don't have control over. And that's something that I'm continually working on in my career and just in my life in general, as a father, as a friend, as a husband, all of those things where so not trying to accept responsibility for things that I can't own.
Yeah. That's great, thank you, Brendan. I'm thinking, and you can tell me if this is right, but that there is this narrative that you have in your own mind, in your own experience about music and the gift and the possibility that music presents to you, but also to these kids, and that you want them to experience that and be in that story.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And how much that is part of the way that our faith is shaped too, right? Is that we're part of this narrative, we're part of this story, and we veer from it, but the challenge is always to come back to it and be reminded about how it shapes us and how we find value in it.
Yeah. Well, and just realizing that there's things that are happening with kids that I'm not even aware of, that I don't really know the effect that I'm having on kids unless they actually say it to me. And they do sometimes. Like, I'll have kids come back and talk to me about the things that I've done, but a lot of times I really don't know. Like, we get through a concert, we get through a performance, and kids are like, yay, that was fun, and then you get that real, that level of excitement. But, like, keep asking yourself the question, is this having an impact? I know it had an impact on me, and I know that my directors growing up were the thing that kept me going through school. They were, that's the reason I went to college. That's the reason that I have the life that I do, is completely because of the teachers that took an interest in me and the life that that I was headed towards. They they knew to help nudge me in the right direction. And so it's like, I know that's true for me, and sometimes it's an act of faith just for me to know, like, okay, I'm doing this thing, and I don't always see that impact with kids. I'm not really sure whether they're getting it or not, whether that spark is happening or not. Like, I don't know. but I just have to have faith that it's making a connection, that they're, you know, it's having an impact for some people.
In a performing art, like music, I'm mindful of the way that, Lori, as you said, that perfectionism can stifle creativity, which is that music is about interpreting. And there are different ways to interpret. When you set up a perfectionist ideal, like the piece can only be performed this one way,
Yeah.
it limits, and in particular I'm thinking about jazz and other sort of improvisation. It's interesting, you hear stories about big band members and how they'd have their sections of improv. When they started to record it, then people started to expect the improvisations to be the same, and so it ceased to be improv.
Yeah.
So, you know, like whether it's sing, 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 or in the mood, suddenly those improvs weren't improv anymore, that people expected the solo that they had heard on the recording.
When Charlie Parker made his recordings, or he played a solo a certain way, people would commit them to memory exactly as he played them. And then, you know, thinking that that was the gospel truth, and it was like, that was the gospel truth in that moment in time, that Charlie Parker wouldn't ever play that solo twice. But because it was recorded that way, there's like that sense, and I think I think that's happened a lot to classical music as well. There was this sensibility that it had to be frozen in time, and it wasn't, you know, but truthfully, the musicians that created that music were dynamic, and Beethoven, he'd be editing his scores right up to the moment of performance. And most concerti, like if somebody had an open section to perform, it was an improvisation, it was not, and somebody at some point would write that down and say, this is the perfect thing that happened, but really, again, it's just a performance is a moment in time. You know, and the thing that really brought that home for me as a performer is like being in musicals where you're playing the same music night after night, and every single performance is different. It's never ever the same. The notes on the page are exactly the same, but I've never had two performances that were exactly the same. They're always different, and to me that's the joy in it, is realizing like, you know, like perfection looks different depending on the night that you're playing. You know, you could just have this moment where you connect with one person, or you hear something being played, and you play off of that, and it's like, okay, this is amazing. That, you know, it's more about the journey and the process, and trying to do that.
Thank you for the authentic description of a dying goose. That was
Yeah.
I know, that
Yeah.
helps.
Come into my band room anytime, and
You were right there.
in September, yeah, and I tell the kids that, I'm like, it will sound like a dying goose, and tell your parents that this is normal. You know, it will be normal.
One thing I was thinking about, especially in like what we're talking about, is when you get more advanced in music, it becomes this thing that this the art, and you have the freedom. But when you're learning, especially like in band, so much of it's judged, and you're told that you have this perfection that you're supposed to go to, and kids are getting told that we didn't perform to the level, like, and so I think it's interesting because I think that can stifle kids and that creativity, because once you get, then later it's like, oh, now I'm no longer being judged, and you know, and so I could see, especially in your position, that perfection that the students are feeling, but as you feeling too, because you are going to like things where you're getting judged, and you are, you know, having all of that, and how that's interesting how we really, it's an art, but we're still putting these like judgments
Well,
on.
and I would say that a lot of that competition has been driven by a means to try to justify what we're doing.
Right.
And so, like, I know that the competition, you know, breeds creativity and innovation and all of that stuff, and I believe that's true, but I believe for kids, that's not what brings, the competition isn't what brings them to music, it's expression. And so when you give them the opportunity to have a little bit of freedom, I was just in an improv session. I went to Bellevue for a music educators conference, and it was there was these guys that were teaching improvisation, and they've created a whole website and a whole, you know, this whole system for helping kids get over the fear of improvising, and to dive into that creativity piece. And one of the impetus behind that, they said, was like some of the trauma that they received from their directors in college especially. And I remember having that experience in college, feeling constantly under a microscope. You made that mistake, you need to fix that. You made that mistake, you need to fix that. And, you know, having a percussion professor that would say, you need to be able to play this scale 20 times without a mistake, you know, and really getting that driven home, and then graduating, you know, after graduating from college and just playing music for the joy of it, realizing like, oh, it can be about this, like why, and realizing too that our education system can be more like that, like we can allow that more for kids. But I'm just as guilty as anybody else of like getting hyper focused on the details, and again, the more I remind myself about it's like it's gonna be rough at the beginning, and allowing us to shape it together and having kids some input on it, have input on that process, I think it goes better, and the kids have more ownership over it in the long run. But it's a hard one because
I like think about it as back to my days of solo ensemble.
oh yeah,
And then
yeah.
knowing who is where and just chair and all of that. And
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
and
Yeah,
just-
my daughter stresses out about that because, you know, she's in orchestra at Ferris, and you know, it's all about chair auditions, and
Yeah.
there's like kind of it kind of suspends the creative brain, and it's more about like, who am I better than? Who,
Right.
you know, I'm sitting second chair, but I need to beat this person out. And,
Right.
Yeah.
yeah.
The couple of other dimensions that I'm thinking about with music that are that create an interesting tension. First of all, we're a very performative society, but we don't think about what it takes to actually arrive at having honed a skill.
Yeah.
And so we want to go, we don't want to be the one that sounds like a goose being choked. But in order to get to that place where we can sound good, we have to learn technically certain skills, but music is not only technical. I remember listening to what's the show where they talked about an NPR show where they talked about whether a person can become a skilled musician simply by repeat performance of the same thing, you know, enough that they had perfected it. And the piece that they came back to over and over again is, you can learn something technically, but that doesn't mean that you are a memorable performer,
Right.
because it takes passion. And I hear you saying that kids are desiring expression, and that's where the passion connects, right?
Yeah.
So, part of your art then is figuring out how to balance those.
Yeah. Because you do have to have the technical skills in order to have expression.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is the middle school world, is like helping them figure out the technical skills, but how do you do it in a way that is fun and engaging and allows them to be creative and express themselves.
Have you dealt yet with middle school kids who are intuitive about music but not technically?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about like people like Bono, who, you know, can grab a guitar and play it, but he would never perform playing guitar, or David Grohl, you know, people who listen to music and intuitively get it, but they're not masterful musicians.
Yeah, well, and I think that it's one of the things that in our education system, we don't always, we're good at teaching the rule followers and not necessarily good at teaching kids like Dave Grohl, because he would tell you himself, he dropped out of high school and his mom was an educator, and you know, but he just didn't fit within that construct.
Yeah.
You know, and that's something that's a challenge, and we don't always do a good job with that.
Yeah. Well, let's move on so we can still hear Kate and Frank. So Kate, tell us your story.
So I joked when I emailed back to Pastor Lori that I was really trying to figure out how do I get out of this. I'm not really a panel person, but I work in front of a computer. I'm behind the scenes, and then my art goes out, and people see it, but they don't see me with my art. And so, but I was like, I think I fit the brief here, so I probably should say yes. And I say that because I recently was hired on with MOPS International as a part-time designer, which is wonderful, and I did MOPS when my kids were little, which is Moms of Preschoolers, and loved my experience with that group and having a community as a young mom. So this opportunity came up and I applied for a part-time position with them. Well, I didn't get it, so I was number 2, and they kind of like kept me in the queue, and they were like, they didn't say no right away, and I was like, what's going on? So they finally came back and they said, so we hired somebody for this position, but both of our designers are part-time and both of them are going on maternity leave within a month of each other. So we're wondering, do you want to come on temporarily to fill this gap? Which I was like, yeah, sure. I mean, I applied for the position. I'd basically be having it for about 4 months. But it's interesting, you know, thinking about like chair positions or whatever. I mean, I was basically second. And so, and my younger self would have been like, I don't want to take that position. I wasn't number 1. I didn't get picked first. But my older self, my more, you know, refined self, I'd like to say, was like, yeah, I mean, I really wanted to, it's a great opportunity to be part of a Christian community and a community that really was important to me when I was a young mom. And so it's been really great to be able to be part of it, and they have loved me despite not being the number 1 pick. And they're trying to find a way to bring me on like as a 3rd designer. They're like, we don't want to lose you. So we'll see. I mean, I'm like halfway through. One designer's coming back next week, and the other one will come back at the end of the month. So we'll see where it lands. But you know, graphic design is all about refining, and it's interesting. I mean, you send out, like when I do logo development, I send out normally 3 concepts, and I call them concepts or initial concepts because they're not going to be the final logo. They're not going to be perfect. They're not going to be what the client wants. And then we go through rounds of revisions on them. And I normally say 3 rounds is about right, but some of them have 10 rounds. You know, I label my files like whatever, you know, Apple logo, and then, you know, 0, or then it's 01, and then 02, and then, you know, some of them, yeah, we land on number 4, and some of them we're on like round 25.
Wow.
Can I break in here for a quick
Yeah.
second? Some of you guys may not know that we are the benefits of Kate's talent, like our Fat Tuesday logo for the past 5 years or whatever, and
We did the
And her
vocation.
oh, the vocation logos. Anyway, she has a broad talent, and she has donated her time to St. Mark, so we really appreciate that a lot.
And I enjoy doing it, and we do. We start with multiple things, and then you know, and sometimes, I mean, there's funny memes and stuff out there on the internet about designers of like, you start with this like beautiful piece, and then it ends up like with all of the terrible advertising stuff that you see, you know, like speech bubbles, and they're like, oh, can't we add this and that, and I want a starburst down here. But other times I look at things and like whatever we started out with, and I'm like, ooh, I really love that, and then the client comes back with, well, how can we do this, or how can we blend these 2 logos together, and I'm like, oh, I don't know. And sometimes they have great ideas, they just don't know how to put it into computer form, and they come out amazing, or they have an idea that makes it what that logo needed. And so it's amazing all the little refinements that you make, and eventually you have something. But I mean, we could refine on one logo forever, but
Right.
at some point you just have to put it out there, and it's what it's supposed to be.
Sort of a philosophical question. Maybe when I get to heaven, I can ask Monet, like, how do you know that's the last brush stroke? And I'm mindful that you're in a collaborative process where it's this is done and then you get feedback. How do you know I'm done? Because you could tinker with something to death, I
Right.
imagine. So how do you know, like the perfectionist in me would tinker it to death, and I have to be able to say, no, that sermon is done, no, that thing I'm saying it's not perfect, but I'm gonna stop. How do you do that in your
Sometimes,
work?
I mean, it's like talking about that now we put like monetary value to things, and so your time. We like to say you can have good, you can have cheap, or you can have fast. Pick two
No.
of the
Yeah.
three.
Right.
And I mean, that's what it comes down to. At
Yeah.
some point, you're kind of like, I mean, it's even like MOPS, they do a theme every year, and so that's coming up, and I'm gonna have to work on that. And they had wanted that to be done by the first pick, you know, the girl that they picked to be their designer, and it didn't happen, so now it's gonna be on me, and I've been kind of stressing about it. I'm like, you know what, it's gonna be probably this next week, and it kind of has to get done because there's a magazine layout that I have to do based on the new theme.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of like, okay, the theme has to be ready for Kate on Monday, and then I have Monday through Friday, and then it has to be done for the magazine
Yeah.
Friday, so it's like,
Yikes.
sometimes it's the time constraint,
Yeah.
and then other times it's just you feel like, oh, I think that it feels right, you know? It's like a vibe. It's
Yeah.
just weird. That's a creative
art.
thing,
Yeah.
so.
I was thinking as I was anticipating you speak, how much your work is like Susan's as a hymn writer. Like once the project has been handed over, it's not yours
Yeah.
anymore.
And that's
Yeah.
true, I mean, some designers, which not as much anymore, try to maintain like rights to it or whatever, but most, I mean, like, I always am like, it's your, you know, like, it's your logo now, and, you know, they might take it to somebody else and have them
Tweak
mess
it.
with it, but they own the files now, and
Mhm.
always been.
We only have 5 minutes.
Yeah, Frank, we need to hear from you.
Well, I want to thank you for asking me because I feel very qualified to be on this forum because it's about imperfection.
You're welcome.
I want to tell you a story about a town in Idaho, Payette, Idaho. How many know Payette?
That's where our pews came from.
Our church pews were made in Payette. And I negotiated for the pews and I went down, and you might know the old pews went to a Mennonite congregation in Montana. So we have our new pews, and I've been to, but the other good thing about Payette is my wife's mother was Miss Payette, 1928. And her beauty comes from her mother. But anyway, my story is I was building a nursing home in 1976 in Payette. And we'd finished the nursing home, and it was being moved into about the first or second week of moving in. So people were there, and I went over and they had one little chore for me to do, was to install a device, a bell or some gizmo on the wall. And sure. So I found the stud and I drilled into the stud, but it wasn't a stud, it was a water pipe.
Oh, no.
So here's this jet of water coming out. So I found the shut off, got the water turned off, went to town and bought a device to fix the leak. I cut a hole in the sheetrock, and then I fixed the leak, and then I thought, now what's next? Because I knew Payette was an hour from where we lived. So to fix a hole in the sheetrock, you have to patch it, and the next day you have to fix it, and the next day, so you got at least 3 days, then you have to paint it. So I had a 2 or 3 hour trip over and back 3 days. And I thought, what am I going to do? So I went back to town and I found a picture. The picture was of a little girl about 3 years old, and she was in the bathroom with her panties down, and she was pulling toilet paper, and she had the whole room full of toilet paper, and her little expression was memorable. So I put the picture over the hole, and the people loved it. The residents were just tickled to death, and the staff appreciated it, and the administration tolerated it. So I thought, I don't have to come back here again. And I didn't.
So what's the lesson?
Well, there's ways to deal with imperfection. When it happens, you have to be creative.
Most definitely.
A holy accident.
As Frank won't tell you, but any good Finnish carpenter knows how to hide his mistakes. That's one of they're there, but they're good at that.
So the thing that amazes me about that is that sounds like my solution. Maybe our expectations were too high of you.
It's a daily experience.
Well, I think it's good to know that Frank actually made a mistake.
Yeah, and that he's willing to admit it.
And really, because
His one and only.
well, no, yeah.
That's hilarious. So did they ever have it repaired?
I have no knowledge.
You didn't look back, you just kept driving.
If they don't call me, I'm not calling them.
Yeah. Any questions?
What else has he done?
Yeah.
What have you done, Frank?
Oh,
Tell us about what other kinds of projects you have done.
Oh, I built nursing homes, apartments, 8 churches, and a lot of school work. So I've been I'm my 71st year of building. I started out when I was 16. I had a job of putting a fence around a drive-in movie. And I recruited 4 of my friends, and we put that, and then I went on and installed all the speakers in the drive-in movie. So
And did you learn as you went, I
I
assume?
didn't make any mistakes there.
I
Hewlett Packard.
That was 1948,
know. Uh-huh.
a long time ago.
And a lot of changes in the building business.
Oh, yeah. When we came to Spokane, I thought I'd find nice pine, and it's rare. It's rarer than oak. And I'm kind of disappointed because I like working with pine and not pallets.
Frank works with really nice ones. Really nice.
It's just because he wants to go to Windsor Plywood.
Well, I do too, but I go to their bargain place. Rip through that and dig out the scraps.
One of the things that I was thinking about with woodwork is how people will take burrs
You make beautiful.
and make beautiful wood products out of these, what we think of as blemishes in trees.
Again, I
Right?
use a lot of old fence boards, you know, the gray ugly things. You can really turn them into some really pretty stuff.
Yeah,
The good thing about mine is I get to burn my mistakes.
right, that's right.
That's true.
Can I finish my, you asked me what I built?
Yes,
We've done big water projects. I built when I see the ball games from Eastern, the football games, I built that water tower up on the hill behind.
Oh, wow.
And I built in
Out in Hilliard.
Hilliard, built a 10 million gallon water tank. It was in an old reservoir, and the open water was too subject to contamination. So I built a 10 million gallon, and I've done several water projects. I've worked on a dam, way up in 600 feet in the air.
yeah, glad you survived those.
I wasn't 600 feet in the air.
You just pointed.
Yeah.
But
No, but but he watched his hard hat fall down into the water.
Ah.
He got off, and you know what he did? He emptied his breakfast. So that was.
Well, thank you
Story.
thank you to all of you. This has been good to get to know you, and thank you for making these connections for us with